Something unbelievable happening right now.
Minnesota Governor Tim Walz joins Kamala Harris in the race for the White House, something State Representative Dave Vella thinks is a great decision.
He can be there as a validator for her and also to say, hey, look, acting like, Donald Trump does, that's not necessarily how a leader should act. He can be an attack dog, which is what a vice president really does, but he can also be a symbol of what a good legislator and a good governor can be.
Representative John Cabello is surprised Harris didn't pick Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. He believes this move could come across as anti-Semitic.
The two most liberal people running on a ticket that are anti-police, that are anti-tax relief, anti-Israel. I don't understand what they're thinking.
Charlie Lasconis with the Winnebago County Democrats believes Republicans are flailing in their attempt to knock Walz down.
One of the knocks on Walz was that he made it so it's easier for people who had felony convictions to vote, as if it was a bad thing. Well, Donald Trump has felony convictions. Felons shouldn't vote. Well, in that case, then maybe Donald Trump shouldn't vote either.
Paul Hoffman with the Winnebago County Republican Central Committee says the best way to combat the Harris-Walz campaign is to look at the current economy.
Also draw attention to foreign policy differences, the state of the world at its present time between the two administrations.